This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Today, Chris and I have a real treat for you. We're going to continue our tour through the genre of mafia movies. And the movie we're going to talk about today is a bit surprising. I think it would be for me if I was listening, and it might be for you. It's Crazy Joe from 1974. And this movie is a fictionalized portrayal of the real life mobster Crazy Joe Gallo. This movie was released in less than 2 years after Joe Gallo's murder in April of 1972. The production process, including the writing of the screenplay and the filming, started really not long, maybe less than a year after Joe's death. Some of the names are changed, and Chris, you mentioned maybe for legal reasons. And I read a little bit that there were some issues with a character who we're going to talk about, Joe Colombo, who is still alive. They didn't really even say Joe Gallo, but so just as a note, this movie is fictionalized. It's highly fictionalized in some cases. Most of the names were changed or modified, and several of the characters are composite characters as well. It was produced by Dino De Laurentiis, who also produced the Valachi Papers. And like the Valachi Papers, it includes this movie includes some famous Italian actors. You'll notice the redheaded Sicilian actor Guido Leontini is back, and I think his voice was dubbed again. Chris, what did you think about Guido Leontini and his menacing figure?
It wasn't as distracting as the Maranzano in the Valachi Papers with that crazy accent that they had. So, yeah, but it's a Dino De Laurentiis, like kind of spaghetti Western mixed with like blaxploitation type of movie. So I knew what I was like getting into when you suggested this movie. I really hadn't heard it before, and then I checked the trailer and I was like, okay, yeah, I know what type of movie this is. And it's a lot of fun. And I mean, you mentioned it being like highly fictionalized, and like we'll go through some of the stuff that they get wrong, but for the most part, it hits all the high points in Joe's life and kind of the crazy life that he led, and why he's such a famous gangster, even though he was never really a boss, and he was never an underboss. And and Peter Boyle does a very good job of playing Joe Gallo in a fun, kind of somewhat menacing sometimes way, wisecracker. It's the impression I get from my reading of Joe Gallo that he would probably be kind of like this. I was joking with you earlier in the week, and I was like, Joe Gallo is the Nicolas Cage of gangsters. Where it's like there's people that just absolutely like loved him and people that absolutely hated him, but he definitely didn't play by the rules. I think the historical accuracy is something that's worth mentioning, because really, if you look at this movie from the 10,000 foot view, it hits every single important part of Joe Gallo's life without question, really. I mean, every single scene is accurate. It's really the detail that it kind of, I would say, almost dresses up, really. Like it doesn't, I wouldn't say that if you want to come in from a technical aspect, there's some stuff that's historically inaccurate, but I think it grabs exactly who Joe Gallo is. And in a lot of ways, Joe Gallo was more fictionalized in real life than you could almost say that he was a real person, because I mean, that's how big of a life he lived. Yeah. And even like Joe Gallo's life is like a movie, really, because there's a bunch of stuff that's attributed to Joe Gallo that's like maybe not necessarily true. Apparently Joe Gallo was like the shooter for the Albert Anastasia hit, but I mean, I've looked into it, and I don't know. It seems pretty questionable to me. Like, it would make sense. Like, apparently Joe used to just take credit for it. And if you're like, a hardened gangster on the streets, and, that's good PR, right? People want to, think that you're a psychopath, and, you'll hit somebody like who's known as the Lord High Executioner in circles. That's the Albert Anastasia was like a straight up psychopath. Like, he killed people because, it paid the bills, but he enjoyed it. He ran like an organization that was called literally Murder Incorporated. And it was like a gang of guys that basically did all the hits for Lucky Luciano. Why wouldn't you want to take credit for that? People are already saying it. You might as well just run with it.
Yeah, I think that's probably when we get into the really interesting stuff is you have the historical Joe Gallo, who is, even in his own life, is kind of piled up with legend, even inside of his own life, even in his death, which we'll get into. There's a lot of legend and question involved. And so it's hard to say what is historically accurate when nobody really knows some of these details, or the details are fogged by people's memories and people blowing up their own ego. And that's a lot of the stuff we're going to get into in this movie. Now, for me, initially looking into it, this movie has all the feeling of a 70s comedy drama. It's the music, the themes, the acting, the production values. They aren't great, and they're not particularly great even for this time either.
Yeah, but to me, this is what kind of gives it some of its charm, is the fact that it's not perfect. Everything nowadays has to be so pristine, like to the point where it's overproduced. It's too much production. I mean, and that has a time and place. Me and you were discussing earlier in the week. Like, I like a lot of kind of artsy films where it's like hyper stylized, but I appreciate like a movie like this where you could tell that some of these sets were just filmed on location, because you can't replicate the filth that they're standing around on a film set. You just can't do it. Like, they're just near some bridge talking, and you can see, cigarette butts that have been butted out, and empty beer cans and empty packs of cigarettes. Like, and it's real because those are all real.
Yeah, that, and then the melodramatic acting of a 70s drama. I really felt like it was kind of a TV drama, but in the very best way. I think that's the thing. Like, any criticism you have of the movie, it's really in the very best way. It did this movie. Dino De Laurentiis and the filmmakers did this movie, I think, in the very best way they could.
Oh yeah, and they did it pretty quickly, like you pointed it out. Like, this started filming like a year after Joe died, and came out like 2 years after the fact. And I mean, we touched on a little bit in the Valachi papers. I think it's really crazy when you stop and think about it. Like, Dino De Laurentiis is producing a film about the Valachi papers, a guy telling you there's a secret society that's secretly in charge of huge segments of the United States, and there's a film, and yet it took how many years before they really started bringing these guys down. And then here we have a film about Joe Gallo, who is, friends with Nicky Barnes, who was one of the, top heroin runners in the United States, and was doing public hits, and was having a mob war 2 years after the fact. We're doing a movie about it, and a lot of the people in the movie, they changed the names and stuff like that. But if you know a little bit of mob history, you know who they are. A lot of these people are still alive, and they're watching a movie about their lives. It's really kind of bizarre.
Yeah, that was the thing. That must have been something for those people watching this movie who actually were living it. Like, there was people. Joe Gallo's one brother was still alive. He lived until I think the early 2000s, maybe even 2010. I don't remember exactly. But I mean, these people were alive. And in a lot of ways, Joe Gallo was a celebrity. And in and of himself, he was certainly a celebrity in New York City, where he would be in all the biggest parties, and he would be on TV in New York City. I mean, very different than what the old Mustache Pete's that we talked about in the Valachi papers. I mean, these guys didn't want to be their picture taken or anything. And Joe Gallo is on the cover of Variety magazine and, all this different stuff. He even had a movie made about him while he was still alive. It was called The Gang Who Couldn't Shoot Straight with Jerry Orbach from Law and Order fame. And they were buddies who would like go and hang around New York City.
Yeah, and that Senate hearing that he had too, where he shows up and he's like just dressed in all black and he's wearing black sunglasses and he's sitting there smoking a cigarette and he's heading on RFK's secretary and he's like, oh, like, and he says something about the rug in his RFK's like office. He's like, oh yeah, this could make a good, I don't know, like it was some gambling game or something like that. But you can go on YouTube and watch this meeting. It's unreal. Like watching this guy just sit there, all black, sunglasses, not answering anything, smoking a cigarette. I mean, Joe kind of like tried to play himself off as a movie character himself because a lot of his mannerisms he copied from a bad guy in this movie, Killing Me Softly, or what was it called?
Oh, The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight.
No, the older movie where he was copied and mimicked the one of the bad guys in the movie.
Yeah. Oh, and that's one of the important scenes in the movie and that was another scene that was historically accurate where a guy, Joe's, I think it was a Jim Cagney movie and Joe's in the theater saying all the lines and the guy says, can you just be quiet, please? I mean, it's New York City. I mean, nobody's going to be polite to each other. And Joe threatens to shoot him or something. And that really happened.
Yeah, that actually, Tommy Udo, that was I believe with the actor's name or the character's name. And he's like, I've watched a bit of it, just those segments just to get a sense of the type of character that Joe was trying to play. And it kind of reminds me of the Joker. I mean, in some ways, Joe Gallo reminds me of the Joker from Batman in some ways, where he just seems to be doing stuff that he finds amusing. And like the rest of the criminals don't really seem to understand, like, well, what's the end game here? And maybe Joe doesn't even know.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, this whole movie, there's something to it. And really, if we go back and we start at Joe, the beginning of Joe's life, and it's Joe Gallo's life, and it starts really in the movie, and he starts as really a low-level street criminal, kind of a mafia associate. And I had read a little bit that the mafia really during this time period wasn't letting in a lot of new maid members, if you will. But so Joe is in Brooklyn and these places, and he's running numbers. He's running vending machines. He's doing hits, but he's not really a high-end mafia guy by any stretch of the imagination. Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
Yeah, and if we go even further back, his dad was never a mob, like never in the mob per se, but he hung around those circles and he like taught him and his sons the tricks of the trade, from my understanding. And it sounds silly, but those vending machines and the jukeboxes that Joe basically ran a monopoly on in that New York region, that was a lot of money. It seems crazy to me now, but like sounds crazy now, but there's a scene in the movie where Joe like rips down like this gumball machine and gives a bunch of gum to the kids because the shop owner won't pay up his dues. But it seems crazy. It's like, oh, what's Joe's number one source of income at this time? It's like, oh, he runs the gumball machine racket. But it was big business at the time. I just thought that was interesting. Like the mafia had a monopoly on jukeboxes in New York.
Yeah, it was a lot of small time stuff like that. And that's what small time hoods like Joe made their money on, like numbers. Really the state took over the numbers with the lottery and knocked them out of it. But it was essentially just the lottery. And it was things like that with Joe's life, like they show that murder scene where it was the very first scene in the movie where they go and they shoot a mafia member in a restaurant. And I think that was supposed to be modeled on the Albert Anastasia hit. even though it was in a restaurant and Albert Anastasia was killed in a barber shop, but they at least to credit that hit to Joe. And it was kind of like you needed somebody really crazy and, off their rocker to hit Albert Anastasia. And who's the young gun to do that? Joe Gallo.
Yeah, well, they set it up perfectly in the movie because, like, leading to that scene where they do the shootout at the restaurant, they're all like singing along to classical music, full blast in their car, and that was like another thing. Like, Joe loved classical music too, and used to listen to it all the time. So you get a sense of, yeah, these guys are a little off their rockers.
Then you have so that scene is kind of something. I think the big thing that it's kind of legend, but there's some probably truth, because that's another thing with all of this mafia stuff, you don't really know 100%, but there's a strong suspicion that Joe Gallo went and kidnapped. He tried to kidnap Joe Profaci. He didn't get Joe Profaci, and Joe Profaci, it was the head of the Profaci crime family, one of the 5 big families. Joe got his underboss, but Joe Gallo got the underboss, but he didn't get the boss. And Joe Gallo kept these underbosses prisoner, I guess you would say, and tried to extract some sort of concessions for more business out of them. And I think that was, if somebody's going to get a crazy moniker, it's probably going to be from doing something like this that was just so off the wall.
It was avoidable too. Joe Profaci he's one of the one of the last old school mustache Pete's, and he didn't really enjoy sharing the wealth around. And in the movie, it's implied that restaurant hit, they cheaped out Joe and his brother and his crew. And Joe's like, I've had enough of this. We're going to do something about this. And I think at one point, Joe wanted to just go kill Joe Profaci, but his brother talked him out of it. And they did the kidnapping. And as you pointed out, Joe gets away. I think in real life, he fled to Florida or something like that for a bit. And then eventually they get a meeting with the rest of the families in the commission. And they basically say, like, this is an internal family matter. This doesn't have anything else to do with us. But they're trying to push Joe to be less cheap and just pay these guys. And that's not what happens. They set up a meeting, and Joe Profaci reneges on the deal, and they get double crossed. And this was what starts the first. It's confusing because at the time, it's called the Profaci family, but it's known as the Colombo War or the Banana War. It ends up becoming the Colombo family, and that's what it is to this day. I mean, Lucky Luciano was the Luciano family that ended up becoming the Gambino family. Is it?
Yeah, a lot of those families got, especially this one, the Profacis, that turned into the Colombos, and then I think they're the Bonanos, and I don't if they're even a thing today. That lineage of Profaci to Colombo, they were the most messed up family of all of the 5 mafia families in New York. They had the most problems.
Yeah, constant like civil wars and characters like Joe, and then we'll get into it later, like Frank Colombo starting the Italian Civil Rights League, and like just kind of like, it's Frank, right?
I think it's Joe Colombo. That's a confusing thing. They're all named Joe. Joe Profaci, Joe Colombo, Joe Gallo. I guess maybe we'll call them by their last names or something.
Yeah, Joe Colombo, and starts this Italian civil, like a lot of crazy stuff that just wasn't going on in Lucchese or the Genovese family or the Gambino family. The Bonanno family was they were always kind of known as like the dirty kind of step kid we'll get into them when we discuss Donnie Brasco, but yeah, they were kind of known as like the dirty stepchildren, I guess, in the 5 families, because like they did a lot of like, I don't know, small time stuff, and they were one of the few families that didn't turn their noses up at drug dealing. I mean, they all did drug dealing, but the Bonanno family like encouraged it.
I think we were going back and forth about this, and I think it's a conversation worth having. I think Joe Gallo really screwed up by just kidnapping people. I think he had to kill Joe Profaci or Joe Colombo or these guys, because that's really how it had to work. Because just by kidnapping them and then having them alive, he created even worse enemies. And that's making enemies with the other families too.
Yeah, because it's affecting their bottom line too. I mean, it's not like there's like an iron wall in between these families. You mentioned Joe's brother. Like Joe's brother ended up leaving. I believe it was Albert Gallo. Larry ended up dying of cancer, which is the one that we see in the movie. Albert Gallo ended up joining the Gambino crime family later on and lived a long life, from my understanding. He ended up retiring, one of the few guys that probably has a chance of retiring in this industry, in this business, without going to jail or getting killed.
Yeah, I think that's important, though, that Joe Gallo, his brother, was able, like you said, the one died of cancer or something, and the other one, I want to say he just died very recently, 2010 maybe. It could have even been later than that. I think he was in his 90s when he died, in his mid to upper 90s. I think somebody like, and I think these are themes we'll start touching upon in all the movies, like Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese. They went and killed the old guys and they took over. And I don't know if Joe Gallo could have necessarily done that, because he wasn't at this point a made man. And I don't know if he was ever truly a made man in his life, because there was a time period where the mafia wasn't, where the five families weren't making new made men.
Yeah, there'd be moments where they would open the books and then they'd be closed for 20 years or something. And then you'd have to wait for somebody to die before you became a made man. You raised the interesting point where, like, he was kidnapping these people. From my understanding, it was his brother Larry that talked him out of killing killing the underboss or killing a couple of the hostages before going and talking to Joe Profaci. That was probably not a smart idea. They probably should have. To be honest with you, this sounds brutal. They probably should have just killed them all.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And then go from there. And then you'd have to, because you put yourself in a corner at that point. It's like, kidnap them. It's about as bad as killing them. In terms of how the mob would look at it and the rest of the families would look at it, you have to kill Joe. Otherwise, I mean, it's all for naught. I mean, and in the movie, and the double cross happens in real life. You look at it, and it's like, I don't know what Joe was thinking, or his brother, or his crew. Like, what did you think was going to happen? Of course, some kind of double cross was going to happen. Do you think Joe Profaci was going to be like, oh, you just kidnapped my entire, close knit crew? I mean, he had a large crew, but these were his closest guys, and like, nothing's going to happen to you. Like, I didn't understand his logic behind that.
Then the scene, and they show this in the movie, is that they go to the mattresses, so to speak. And this is what they call the first Colombo War, which just would have been in the early 1960s, where the Gallo and his faction get into a major conflict with the Colombos, and it kind of just peters out. But one of the interesting things is, when Joe was in his hideout, he actually saved a bunch of kids from a burning fire somewhere in Brooklyn or somewhere in New York City. And Joe went into a burning building and saved these kids. And I think that shows to me so much how complicated these guys are. Joe Gallo would have no problem killing some other mafia guy, like no compunction whatsoever of strangling them or shooting them in the middle of the restaurant. But that's also a guy who's going to go into a burning building before the fire department would to go save a couple of kids. To me, it's hard to wrap my mind around.
I mean, reading about a lot about these gangsters leading into doing these films. They were on it. It sounds cliche, but they really were a different class of criminal compared to what we're used to seeing now. They did have some kind of sense of honor to a degree. Like, for the most part, they did try to keep the violence off the streets and keep it all in house. And he's known as Crazy Joe. And I mean, one of the reasons was apparently he was mildly schizophrenic and, had like these crazy eyes. But I mean, how many people do you know that are not mafia guys that would go into a burning building and risk their own lives to save somebody else's kids? I mean, there's probably a couple, but there'd probably be a lot more people that wouldn't do that, or they'd freeze in that situation where Joe didn't freeze, obviously, and save those kids' lives. It's a different class of criminal. Even if you look at somebody like John Gotti, who, he wasn't an angel, but you compare him to a lot of like these street gangs now and a lot of the gangsters now. It's a different class of criminality is the best way I can put it.
I think somebody like Joe Gallo, and I think in the way the movie kind of sets this up, but it's a setup in real life with the Italo American Civil Rights League. And Joe Gallo really, in a lot of ways, he just wanted to be a big man in his neighborhood. I mean, they show it in the movie and it was in real life. Like, he liked being with the people. He liked kids hanging around him and palling around with him. But he also had no problem. Like, if somebody wasn't paying him his money for vending machines or what he was owed on a little bit of gambling, that he was going to break somebody's fingers off. But he just wanted to be respected. It's almost, it comes back to a thing that Chris and I have talked a lot about. He's almost like a Viking lord, or like a lord in the medieval. He had a group of guys, his retainers. And the thing that kept Joe in power is that people respected him and they wanted him in power. And I think there is a major comparison to criminal gangs in the 20th century, these mafia gangs in a lot of ways, to Anglo-Saxon and Viking and Visigothic warrior bands in the Middle Ages, that they had crews of retainers and they did things that were basically extortion. But that was the thing that kept them in power. That was the rule of the law of the day.
Yeah, well, there's definitely a comparison for sure. And like a good lord, if you're good at what you're doing and people respect you, it makes your job a little bit easier. But at the same time, you have to be able to keep a little bit of a distance where it's like, yeah, Tony at the meat shop, he's a good friend of mine. But if Tony starts not paying on time, and then, Freddie down the street's not going to pay on time either. And I can't allow that to happen, because at the end of the day, these guys did provide a bit of a service. And when we get to Goodfellas, we'll discuss it, where Henry talks about the thing that the FBI never really understood about the mob is like they provided protection for people that couldn't go to the cops for protection. And that was the main function of the mob. And this goes all the way back to Sicily. And even when, early Italian immigrants came over, they didn't trust the cops, and the cops didn't trust them either. So a lot of the mafia guys played this role. I say that if Joe Gallo was in your neighborhood, I don't think your local liquor store was going to be held up, by gunpoint. I don't think there would be guns going off in your kid's playground. This stuff just didn't happen, but now it's commonplace.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. Then the next big scene that happens is Joe extorts a small business to raise funds after the war with the Colombos. And that that had some connections to real life, and that Joe was really tapped out. Joe Gallo was really tapped out after this war with the Colombos. And he started shaking people down for more money this particular situation in the movie, it's a liquor store. I think I can't remember what it was in real life. It was like a small, like grocery shop type deal. And honestly, Joe Gallo was probably set up by the Pravachis or the Colombos. They were the ones who probably told the police. And Joe got a lot of time for this. He got 10 years in jail, and it was serious jail time. He spent time in three of the toughest jails in New York State: Greenhaven, Attica, and Auburn. He got no breaks in there. But what were some of the things that they showed in the movie, and that happened in real life with Joe, particularly him becoming a reader?
Yeah, he became an incredible reader. Something, from my understanding, he wasn't really, I'm sure he read a bit, but it wasn't like something Joe was really known for. But when he hit prison, he learned the speed reading technique, and apparently back in the day it used to be quite popular. I don't know. I'm sure there's a lot of people that do it, but I don't know. I don't know anyone personally that can do the speed reading technique. And he just devoured books, like just basically everything: history, classical music, you name it. And he took up art, and he made connections to some of the black gangs, the African American gangs that were in the family. And I mean, this might seem a little crazy to us now, that the mafia just didn't do any work with blacks back then, but it really was unheard of. And Joe was making connections with, in particular, the gangster Nicky Barnes in one of the prisons. And in the movie, it seems like he spent his entire time in one prison, but it was actually three. And then when him and Nicky Barnes were making their connections, they ended up splitting the two up into separate prisons. Or doesn't apply in the movie that they call him something different in the movie, that Nicky Barnes gets out, and he's waiting for Joe to come back. What actually happened is they just moved them to different prisons. So he started making connections with them, and it ends up paying somewhat dividends when he gets out of jail. And there's an interesting scene in the movie where the prison riot happens, and Joe saves a prison guard. That actually did happen. There was I don't know if it was like the show in the movie was like Nicky Barnes and the black gang, and they're ones who started the riot. I think this was at a different prison, if I'm remembering it correctly. But he actually did save this prison guard. It probably would have been killed, or at least brutally injured. Which is, is just another perplexing thing about Joe Gallo. Like, why is he saving prison guard? They're not going to take any time off his sentence, and I'm sure these prison guards weren't very nice to him.
Yeah, I think that's one of those things that that was just for Joe Gallo. That was the right thing. He didn't want to, for whatever reason that just came in his mind, he didn't want to see the prison guard. Maybe he liked the guy and he didn't want to see him get brutalized in these riots. But this was kind of the time of the Attica riots, and, the very famous Attica riots. That wasn't the one that Joe was at, but I think it was the one in Auburn prison. But Auburn prison is just like everything you think of Attica, and Auburn's even more brutal than Attica. All of these things that Joe was involved in. I think one of the big things for me, though, is that as interesting as it was for Joe, when he came out of prison, he spent his 30s and the 1960s, which were just, the 1960s was the golden era of the mafia. And Joe Gallo would have been a young guy in the 1960s. And it just kind of, that being out of the mix during that time, I think absolutely killed his career as a mobster. It was almost, he had to come out of jail swinging, and how larger than life he came out of jail. That's maybe what in the end killed him, literally killed him.
Yeah, when he comes out of jail, he, like you pointed out, it's like he's got to remind everyone, Joe Gallo, Crazy Joe's back. And there's a famous part of the history where a peace agreement came about between the Profaci and the Gallo factions in this civil war, and I believe it's Joe Colombo offers Joey Gallo, I think it was like $1,000 or something like that, and Joe Gallo's like, "Well, you guys came up with this peace agreement when I was in jail. Like, this has nothing to do with me." And he's like gung ho, ready to start the war right again. I mean, he does somewhat have a point. He's like, when I was thrown in prison, he probably thought to himself, he probably was set up by the Profacis too in the back of his head. And, Colombo offers him $1,000 to be like, "Oh, it's all good now." It's like even I know $1,000 was a lot more in the 70s, but I mean, it's not a lot, especially after you just spent 10 years in prison. You don't have a dime to your name, and that was one of the characters they kind of like mix together a bit, where if I'm understanding correctly, they mixed Carmine the Snake Persico and Joe Colombo together, because like Persico was like one of his best friends, and they show in the movie he betrays them early in the movie to the Profaci family, and from my understanding, he did try to kill Joe's brother, and he's a fascinating character in mob history. But they kind of mixed the two of these together, where like Joe Colombo and Joey Gallo, I'm sure they knew each other, but they weren't like particularly super close.
Yeah, that was another one that Eli Wallach, the actor, he played Don Vittorio, I think his name was. And he was a person in a different family who was sort of Joe's guardian angel and his mentor. And he was played kind of as a Vito Genovese character, but Vito had died, I think, in the early 60s. So Vito was dead already by this point. And that's kind of how he was being, that Eli Wallach, it was his character of Don Vittorio, was supposed to be. There was a bunch of characters. They didn't call Joe Colombo. They called him something else, but he really did start this Italo American Civil Rights League. And I think it was absolutely brilliant. It was brilliant in its conception. And I think it was brilliant in something that Colombo could have run with. It was basically this Italo-American Defense League or Support League was set up as a sort of an NAACP for Italian Americans. And the whole thing was supposed to be that the mafia didn't exist and that this was just a gigantic slur against Italians, Americans of Italian descent. And it was so effective in that they got the makers of The Godfather, which the Godfather movie comes out at about this time, to not use the words mafia or La Cosa Nostra. You watch it and it's almost jarring in The Godfather that they don't use La Cosa Nostra and they don't use the word mafia. And that's because of the Italian American Defense League. I think the brilliance in it and the initial brilliance and the mafia dons and the bosses didn't like it because they thought it was bringing too much attention to the mafia. But I think the genius is that Joe Colombo almost really believed in it. And I think that in the end, he could have made as much money running a civil rights league like this than he could have as a mafia don.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, and we could get into, from my understanding, Joe Colombo did somewhat start believing in this, where he started seeing the reaction that he was getting from, just Italian Americans, and it kind of changed him a bit. Everything that I've seen and read, that it did seem to change him a bit. But he could have ran it just like kind of like a mafia organization, in the sense like, oh, this whole thing's a scam and I'm just going to be making some money. But I mean, in actuality, if he was allowed to go further and further with it, who knows? Maybe the Italian Civil Rights League would have their own place in Congress, like the Black Civil Rights, right? It's very possible that could have happened. I don't really think it could have. It's possible if Colombo stepped out of the picture, but I mean, I don't know. I don't know if the thing would have worked if Colombo had stepped out of the picture. Like, I don't think he could have just put anybody in there. I mean, Colombo was the character himself. He was a fascinating guy.
If Colombo ran it like, there's a Catholic organization that's kind of like that. And I think Colombo would have had to have completely divorced himself from the mafia. It was a tough sell, though, I think, at that point for Italian Americans to say that they were being super discriminated against. But I think it was something that if he had thrown himself into, I think he could have made something of it. But he would have had to have entirely divorced himself from the mafia and completely invested in this. And I don't know if he was, if things had gone a little differently, he could have done it. But he was so much in both camps at that point in the early 1970s, it wasn't going to happen that he could be really the civil rights leader and a mafia boss.
Well, not just a boss, one of the five families, like the boss of the bosses, right? That's why it would never would have worked. Like, I could see it maybe if he divorced himself entirely from the mob. Eventually, like, this Italian Civil Rights League would have to start talking about the mob and being like, look, the cops and nobody's doing anything about this mob and it's keeping down regular Italians, yada, 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 because this is discrimination against Italians. Like, you could have done it. Like, he really, thinking, just using my imagination, how crazy it would have been if like Colombo was like the one leading the crusade against the Italian mob, like, like a decade before it actually happened. It really could with this Italian Civil Rights League, because then he would have like, I mean, the mob jokes about it, but there is some truth to it. He would have the most powerful mob kind of backing him up. The government, they print their own money and they have their own police force.
I think I may be stretching this a little bit, but I think that the Italo-American Defense League was one of the major things that pushed to get Columbus Day as a recognized federal holiday in the U.S. Like, that's how much, for that like very brief time, they had a lot of pull in what was going on. But the big thing that blew up the Italo-American Defense League, that basically you can go on to YouTube and watch the moment it ended, was at a big rally at Columbus Circle in New York City. Joe Colombo's up there, and the movie shows this absolutely precisely. A young African-American guy shoots Joe Colombo, and Joe Colombo doesn't die, but he's grievously wounded, and he'll die a couple of years basically from his wounds. And if it wasn't, I think that the assassin was the guy who shot Colombo, was shot and maybe beaten to death on the scene. But they show the crowd, they're beating up the guy who shot Colombo. They're beating up the cops. Like, it's an absolute insanity. The movie, I think, uses real footage of that, but you can go on YouTube and actually watch the real footage, and it's absolutely bonkers what happened at this scene in Columbus Circle when Joe Colombo shot.
Yeah, and even in the movie, they show a couple of rallies, and me and you were talking. I'm like, some of this is just stock footage from this rally, and it shows you just how big these things were too. Yeah, and then when the assassination happens, everyone points their finger at like, oh, Joe Gallo is the one that ordered the hits, because Joe was the only guy in any of the the mafia circles that was hanging out with African Americans. So but it very well could have been the other families just hired some African American that, I don't know, maybe frequented one of their bars and knew it was a little bit loony and was like desperate to try to get into the gang. And they're just like, oh, you got to do this. And I mean, that's, to me, seems just as plausible too, because none of them were really happy about this Italian Civil Rights League, even not the old school guys, because it just brought so much attention to the mob. And the fact that, he was one of the bosses in the Five Families. He's up there running an Italian civil rights league, talking about like, all the mafia is not real. Like, it wasn't like, oh, he was like, maybe had some connection. Like, he was as connected as you possibly could be. I read some theory that the guy who shot him, he used to frequent some, and I guess it was some homosexual bar that one of the mob guys owned, and this was the connection. I can't remember which family it was exactly, but this was the theory that the person came up with, and they didn't believe that Joe Gallo really had anything to do with this hit. It doesn't seem like something Joe Gallo would do anyways. Joe Gallo, he comes across as a guy that he was going to kill Joe Colombo. He would just probably do it himself.
Or have somebody of his crew. I don't think that he would have just had some rando do it. That doesn't seem to be Joe's style, unless he was sending a message that now I'm Joe Gallo and I'm with, I have this connection with the African American gangs in New York City, and we're together now, and we're putting the end to that. But I think there would be no mistake, and we wouldn't be debating this, and scholars wouldn't be debating that to this day. I think it would have been no mistake that it would have been a guy associated with one of, what was the name of the guy that Joe Gallo connected with in jail?
Nicky Barnes.
Nicky Barnes was absolutely enormous. He founded a sort of a commission or a five families of African American gangs in New York City. I mean, this guy was big time, and I just don't have any. I have no doubt in my mind that if Nicky Barnes and Joe Gallo were the ones behind this, we would know it today.
And thinking, using a little bit of logic too, right? If you're one of the other bosses in the five families or part of the commission, and you want to make it, we want to get rid of Colombo, but if we send one of our other Italian guys, it's just going to bring even more eyes on the mob, because they'll be very obvious who did this, right? Where like if we send this black guy or this African American, whatever word you want to use, it takes the heat off them, and then it puts it on Joe, and they already don't like Joe to begin with. So there's a lot of different ways to look at it. But like you pointed out, Joe, maybe he would have done the hit himself, or he would have got one of his, close buddies to do it. And there wouldn't be any, that's not the impression. He doesn't come across as like, he wouldn't brag about like, I'm the one who whacked Joe. I'm going to do you next.
Yeah. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. I think though that maybe that put even though, I mean, our conclusion is Joe Colombo probably wasn't behind it, but enough people thought Joe Colombo was, or Joe Gallo rather, so many Joes, too many Joes, that Joe Gallo was behind the killing of Joe Colombo. Joe Gallo, Crazy Joe, started to do a lot of things in the New York City scene. We were talking about it. He became friends with actor of Law and Order fame, Jerry Orbach. Jerry Orbach did a movie called The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight that was based on Joe Gallo's gang, which, I mean, that shows you how much prominence Joe Gallo's gang had in the late 1970s, that a movie was made about them when he was still alive. He became friends with Jerry Orbach, and they went to all the bars and all the place that the cool kids went to in New York City. And then Joe Gallo goes before Robert F. Kennedy's commission and some of these other senator commissions. And he's, like you were saying, with his slicked back black hair and his Ray-Ban sunglasses and black jacket. I say I'm the Fifth Amendment, and he pours it on. I mean, it's just so ridiculous. And I think that just kept putting more and more targets onto him.
Yeah, especially when, from my understanding, like when he came out of prison, it was when he really started hanging around, celebrities, and became like a local celebrity in New York. And you pointed out, hanging out with movie stars, and producers and, people with lots of money were not like really part of the mob and became kind of a larger than life character. Which, I mean, in actuality, he really was. Joe's an interesting guy. I could see Joe going on your other podcast, The History of the Papacy, and just having a conversation with you about something in history, because he was incredibly well read, or something about classical music. And then just going to the bar and like shooting the stuff about sports, and then just go like, oh yeah, okay, sorry, I got to make some time. I got to go whack this guy. But that's the type of person that I think Joe was. Like, he could sit there and have a conversation with anybody, and he would be probably fascinating conversation.
That really ties in. There's a bunch of scenes of with Fred Williamson, which I think we haven't given Fred Williamson enough credit. I mean, he was amazing in the movie, and everybody really played their character to a T in the movie. That's what I think that's what I really loved about the movie, is that everybody really like put out for this movie. They tried their best. And this leads us to the last scene. And I think this is one of the more interesting scenes of the movie, is when Joe Gallo was killed in a restaurant. And in the movie version is how I wanted it to happen. And in real life, I'll explain what happened in real life really quickly. In real life, Joe Gallo on his 43rd birthday was out late night with his family. Like, it wasn't even with other mobsters. It was with I don't know if it was his wife at the time, or maybe it was his ex-wife and his daughter and a couple of family friends at a place called Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy. This place is not a fancy restaurant. It's kind of like a greasy spoon, a kind of place where you get your food served on paper plates, and you get paper cups of Pepsi or Coca-Cola. Like, it wasn't a fancy restaurant. It was a place you went. I get the kind of impression it was a place you went maybe out after a long night, and you'd get something quick to eat. And him and his family, they're just eating. This is kind of the controversial part that we'll get into. Somebody or a group of somebodies comes into the restaurant, shoots him. Joe falls out of the restaurant and dies. And that's pretty much it. And the controversial part is that if anybody's ever watched The Irishman, they show this part of the movie, and Crazy Joe's played by the comedian Sebastian Maniscalco or Maniscalco. But in the movie, it's only done by Frank Sheeran, who's played by Robert De Niro. And if you watch or read the book, what is it called? A guy who paints houses or something.
I Heard You Paint Houses. I think they just switched the title to The Irishman since the movie came out, but I Heard You Paint Houses is the original title of the book.
Yeah, and this guy, this Frank Sheeran, was a mafia associate, a mafia hitman, and he was also a big name in the union, in the Teamsters Union out of Philadelphia. And he claimed to have been the person who, the sole gunman who went in, shot Gallo, and then left. He went all the way. He was a big name in Philadelphia. He wasn't a New York City guy. There's some other people who claimed to do the killing, or claimed that another guy did the killing. His name doesn't really matter, but they did it with a gang of people. And I was wondering if you got a sense of what was more likely to have happened. It sounded to me, I don't know. I'd like to hear what you have to say, because I have a couple of thoughts, but I might be completely off base.
There's so much conflicting information where apparently I believe it was his ex-wife said there was 3 guys there, but then other people said it was just one guy, like Paul Coffey, who's like a famous detective. And I'm trying to remember, there was another mafia author's name. They believe it was one guy, and they tend to believe Frank Sheeran. And I recently had just finished the book where Frank Sheeran basically, he confesses to killing Jimmy Hoffa, who it reads like a confession where he's trying to get this off, like before he dies, like you would confess to a priest. It doesn't come across like he's bragging about, oh, I'm the one who did Hoffa, because Hoffa was his best friend. And he also says that he killed Joey Gallo in the book. And the author, the one who wrote the book,
was that Paul
interviewing and
Coffey?
talking. No, it was another guy, Brandt, I believe his name is. He believes him, and at one point he was thinking about maybe leaving it out of the book, but from my understanding, he looked at the evidence and he tended to believe that was the case, that Frank Sheeran had killed him. But I mean, Frank Sheeran, they're saying like there was like Italians, and Italians are not famous for being super tall to begin with, and Frank Sheeran was like 6'5" and like 230 pounds. He was like a giant at the time, and he's Irish. So, what's going on here? I don't know. Do I think Frank Sheeran killed Jimmy Hoffa? I mean, it would be a pretty crazy thing to admit to in your like late 80s. I think he was at the time that they were writing the book. And I mean, he didn't gain anything from it. I don't think his family got any money from the book. Maybe they did. I don't know. But I think he was telling the truth about that. At the very least, he knows who did it and how it went down. At the very least, he knows that.
I keep going back and forth with this. I probably have thought about it much more than I ever should have spent time on this. But I think that there is something to say that Frank Sheeran wanted to do kind of a, like you said, like a final confession of his life. And why would he lie about that? But then why would he lie about that? He's a career criminal, and criminals lie about stuff. That I didn't read the book, so I can't say. I don't get a sense of it. I know Paul Coffey, the mafia writer, he did believe Frank Sheeran at first, but then he also came out later and had some questions about Frank Sheeran's account. I think it's big talk that Frank Sheeran said that he killed Jimmy Hoffa. There's big talk that he killed Jimmy Hoffa. Maybe that's true. I think there's too much question. And I think there's kind of the question of if Colombo, who wants to kill Joe Gallo? The obvious answer is the Colombo family / Profaci family. They're the ones who want to kill them. Let's start building the case. Would you agree with that? That those are the only ones who really want him dead?
And I would say the rest of the families they didn't like what Joey Gallo was doing in terms of a lot of the craziness and the attention that he was bringing to the family. Because we mentioned earlier, he's like hanging around with celebrities and, he's dealing deals with African-American gangs. They didn't like any of this. So, I mean, he was the dirty stepchild to begin with. The argument that Frank Sheeran might have done it is like Russell Buffalino, who was like his boss or what have you, because Frank was an Irish. He could never get made. He never was really officially part of the mafia. Basically, they talked to the rest of the 5 families, and they said they wanted this done, and he knew Frank was good at what he did. That's the logic behind it. That's the argument behind it. But as you pointed out, it makes a little bit more sense that like the Profaci / Colombo family would want it done, because that was the family that was having the most trouble with Gallo. Anyways, they get Gallo to the picture. Maybe some of this craziness can stop, and we just get back to doing what we're supposed to be doing, is make money.
Yeah, and that's a thing to me is if it was either just the Colombos or if it was the whole 5 families of New York, why job it out to Russell Buffalino in Philly to clean up their mess? Joe Gallo was their mess. It seems to me like they would want to put their own stamp on that, unless, and this is a big unless, that Joe Gallo would have recognized any hitman who was going to come in from New York, and he would have had his guard up for that. Is that maybe a possibility? And so you need Frank Sheeran to come from out of town to do it. Maybe
I mean, that's a possibility, right? Frank walks in, that doesn't probably, he's never seen Frank in his life. Big Irish guy. He's not really concerned. That would, I guess, right? But if like the five families did say decided that they were going to whack Joe, I mean, they would somebody would have taken credit for it. Would they? It's weird that nobody really took any credit for it if it was them, because immediately everybody, when John Gotti's, did the hit on Paul Castellano, everybody knew right off the bat it was Gotti. When Lucky Luciano took out Marizano, everybody knew Lucky Luciano was the one that did it. He took credit for it. It's weird that nobody in the five families would have taken credit for it, right?
Yeah, there is a lot of weird stuff about that. I think one of the other things is that maybe they just wanted Joe out of the picture, because honestly, like we were saying before, Joe died in 1972. His brother rose through the ranks and he was an underboss in the families. He became a made man in a couple of years. So whatever the stain of Joe Gallo didn't affect his brother at all, who was in his crew.
No, it would seem to be just in particular Joe, because he wasn't playing by the rules, wasn't working with the rest of the families. And that's the thing with the mafia is, if you go off and try to do your own thing and you're not working with the rest of the guys, you're probably going to end up whacked, or at the very least in prison. And, that's why the Italian mafia was so successful for so long, was because people like Joe would get taken care of internally. Whereas a lot of other gangs, Joe, because of his craziness, might have rose to the top, but because of his craziness, it was not going to be very lasting. He wasn't going to, plant a serious organizational structure within whatever gang he was going to run. And it's, he pointed out his brother lived on for a long time, but like the rest of the Gallo crew, from my understanding, just either went to prison or were killed.
I love the ending scene of how they portray it in the movie Crazy Joe, as Joe is having his birthday dinner, but it's in a fancy Italian restaurant, and his whole crew is there, including Fred Williamson, and they're making jokes, and Henry Winkler, the Fonz, is in the movie too, and they're just having a good old time drinking wine. And then the shooters coming in. I think they portray it. It's interesting. They took a hybrid approach to it. They show one person come in who looks kind of Irish, maybe. He almost looks like the real Frank Sheeran. And then I think three people come in, but then they have like this massive shootout. And I think Crazy Joe actually kills one of them, and Fred Williamson kills one of them. I mean, it turns into a crazy action scene. But I think that's the way. Isn't that the way you want Joe Gallo to go out? You don't want him just to be assassinated from behind in a greasy spoon. You want him having a big mafia style dinner, and he takes out a couple of them on his way out while he's partying with his friends.
Yeah, exactly. You want a movie star ending for a guy that pretty much led a life that sounds like it came out of a movie.
As far as mob movies, because we've both seen our share of them, how do you think this ranks?
I mean, I would give it a solid. I would give it like a 7.5 out of 10. Like, I think it's a fun movie. It's you mentioned like some of the acting's a little kind of iffy, and some of the production values, even for the time, weren't like the greatest. And if you want to watch like a fun movie where you get the general idea of Joe Gallo's life and it hits all the high points, and I mean, Peter Boyle does a great performance of him. It's one of a kind, really. I really enjoyed his performance. Yeah, it's a great. I don't know. To me, it's a fun movie. It's a great movie, and it gives you a little kind of throwback vibes to drive-in movies back in the day and the blaxploitation type movies, even though it's not really it's in that style. And then there's been like Quentin Tarantino's like tried to recreate it, but it's not the same. You can't do it with like a big budget. You just can't recreate that. It's got to be small budgets and guerrilla style.
That's interesting. You bring up Quentin Tarantino. Couldn't you see this movie being remade by Quentin Tarantino with somebody like Nicolas Cage starring? Like, I don't think that's a movie that would ever be made in Hollywood today, but that would be a fantastic movie.
Yeah, when I first watched the movie, that was the thing. I think it was one of the first things I said. It's like, when reading about Joe, it's like, I want to see Nicolas Cage play Joe Gallo, because he was born to play that role. Where if you're going to do a movie about Joe Gallo, the focus is going to be on him, because it's obviously he's a larger than life character, and Tarantino was famous. That's what he does best, is presenting these larger than life characters, these memorable characters. Oh, that'd be a match made in heaven. Tarantino and Nicolas Cage, the Crazy Joe story. I think we should try to make it happen. We'll tag him on Twitter.
Yeah, if you do this, Quentin, you owe us for this one. I think for me, honestly, like watching this movie, it has moved up into one of my favorite movies of all time, because it encapsulated so many genres that I love. I love 70s movies like this. I love that blaxploitation kind of vibe that you get from it, and that 70s vibe that didn't take itself too seriously. On top of the Italian spaghetti Western, you got the feeling with the Dino De Laurentiis, he didn't quite understand America. You're getting it from a different perspective, and I love that. I would say I agree with you as far as, I would give it maybe even more of an 8.5 out of 10. I think as far as mafia movies go, it's edging into the first tier for me. I'm that serious about the movie. As far as movies overall, it's edging into my top 10 for sure. I think that this movie was such a shock to me that I had never seen it before and never heard of it. And it really, if you're into that early 70s vibe with those cars and with that style of acting and with those themes, this movie just punches every one of your tickets.